The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Steinway Hall as David pulled up in his expensive black car. He stepped out, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit and checking his reflection in the car window. Everything had to be perfect today. After all, he was David Rodriguez, the pianist everyone talked about. At 28, he had already won 12 major competitions and performed in some of the world's most famous concert halls. David grabbed his leather briefcase containing his sheet music and walked toward the impressive building. The regional piano competition was being held here today, and honestly, he wasn't worried at all. He had been playing piano since he was 4 years old. His parents had spent thousands of dollars on the best teachers, the finest instruments, and exclusive master classes with world-renowned musicians. As he entered the grand lobby, David noticed other competitors already there. Some looked nervous, shuffling through their music sheets and practicing finger exercises in the air. Others sat quietly, probably trying to calm their nerves. David smirked to himself. These people had no idea what real talent looked like. The registration desk was busy with contestants checking in. David walked past the line of waiting musicians and straight to the front. The volunteer at the desk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up at him. "Excuse me, sir, but there's actually a line," she said politely. David flashed his most charming smile. "I'm David Rodriguez. I believe I'm on your VIP list." The woman checked her papers and nodded. "Of course, Mr. Rodriguez, here's your competitor number and schedule. You're performing in the afternoon session." As David took his materials, he couldn't help but notice the other competitors watching him. Some whispered to each other, clearly recognizing his name. This was exactly the kind of attention he loved. He had worked hard to build his reputation, and moments like these reminded him why he was better than everyone else. David made his way to the practice area, where several small rooms with pianos were available for warming up. As he walked down the hallway, he could hear different pieces being practiced behind closed doors. Most of it sounded amateur to his trained ear. Sloppy timing, poor technique, lack of emotional depth. These people were just wasting everyone's time. He found an empty practice room with a beautiful grand piano and set up his music. David had chosen to perform Chopin's Ballad No. 1, a piece that required both technical skill and artistic interpretation. He had been perfecting this piece for months, and his teacher had assured him it would easily win any regional competition. As David began his warm-up exercises, his fingers moved effortlessly across the keys. Years of rigorous training had made these movements feel natural. He thought about his upcoming performance and how impressed the judges would be. They probably hadn't heard playing of this caliber in years at a regional event like this. After about 30 minutes of practice, David decided to take a break and observe his competition. He walked back into the main practice area, where he could hear various pianists working on their pieces. Most of the music drifting from the rooms confirmed his initial assessment. These were clearly amateur players who had probably learned piano as a hobby. That's when he noticed her. In the corner of the large practice room sat an old, upright piano, nothing like the grand pianos in the private rooms. At this humble instrument sat a woman who looked to be in her early 30s. She was wearing a simple blue dress, nothing fancy or expensive. Her long black hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail, and she wore no jewelry except for a simple watch. What caught David's attention wasn't her appearance, but the fact that she was playing so quietly he could barely hear her. She seemed to be practicing scales and basic exercises, the kind of stuff beginners worked on. Her posture was decent, but she lacked the commanding presence that real pianists developed over years of performing. David watched her for a few moments, feeling a mixture of pity and confusion. What was someone like this doing at a serious competition? This wasn't a community center recital or a local talent show. This was a regional competition that attracted some of the best pianists in the state. The entry fee alone was several $100s, and the required repertoire was extremely demanding. He noticed that she had a small stack of sheet music beside her, but from where he stood he couldn't see what pieces she had chosen. Probably something safe and easy, he thought. Maybe a simple Mozart sonata or a basic Chopin waltz. Those were the kinds of pieces that amateur players usually attempted when they wanted to sound sophisticated. The woman seemed completely focused on her practice, unaware that anyone was watching her. She played with careful attention to every note, but there was something almost timid about her approach. She wasn't taking up much space, wasn't making much noise, and seemed to be trying her best to stay out of everyone's way. David shook his head and turned away. He had seen plenty of people like this over the years. They took piano lessons as adults, maybe played at their local church or community events, and somehow got the idea that they could compete with serious musicians. It was almost sad, really. They had no understanding of what real musical training involved. He thought about his own journey to this moment. The countless hours of practice, often 8 to 10 hours a day. The competitions he had won starting from age 6. The master classes with famous pianists who had shaped his technique and interpretation. The university degree in piano performance from one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. The years of building his reputation through professional performances and recordings. This woman, sitting at her little upright piano in her simple dress, represented everything that was wrong with these regional competitions. They let anyone enter as long as they could pay the fee and claim they could play the required pieces. It diluted the whole event and wasted everyone's time. David returned to his practice room and continued working on his Chopin. As he played, he imagined the moment when he would take the stage that afternoon. The audience would recognize immediately that they were hearing something special. The judges would probably exchange glances, knowing they had found their winner within the first few measures. He thought about the prize money, which was substantial for a regional event. More importantly, winning here would qualify him for the national competition next year, where record label executives and concert promoters would be watching. This was just another stepping stone in his carefully planned career. As David finished his practice session, he felt completely confident about the day ahead. He had the best training, the most experience, and undoubtedly the most talent of anyone competing today. The woman at the upright piano and all the other amateur players would soon learn what real piano playing sounded like. Little did David know that his assumptions about that quiet woman in the corner would soon be challenged, in ways he never imagined. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who don't look dangerous at all. An hour before the competition began, all the contestants gathered in the main reception area for a brief meet-and-greet session. The competition organizers had arranged this informal mixer to help everyone relax and get to know each other. Before the serious business of performing began, David walked into the room, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He wore his success like an expensive cologne, subtle but unmistakable. Other competitors immediately recognized him, and several approached to introduce themselves. He enjoyed these moments, graciously accepting their compliments about his previous performances, while maintaining just the right amount of humble confidence. "Mr. Rodriguez, I heard your performance at the state finals last year," said a young man who looked barely out of college. "It was incredible. I'm honestly not sure why I'm even competing today." David smiled and patted the young man's shoulder. "Everyone deserves a chance to perform. Just do your best and learn from the experience." As David continued making his rounds through the room, he overheard a conversation that caught his attention. The woman from the upright piano was talking quietly with another competitor near the refreshment table. She was holding a cup of coffee in both hands as if trying to warm herself, and speaking in a soft voice that David had to strain to hear. "I teach piano at the community center downtown," she was saying. "Mostly kids and some adults who are just starting out. It's really rewarding work even though it doesn't pay much." The other competitor, a woman about the same age, nodded sympathetically. "That sounds wonderful. What made you decide to compete today?" The community center teacher paused for a moment, looking down at her coffee. "Well, my mother has been encouraging me to get back into performing. She says I have a gift that I shouldn't waste. I haven't competed in anything like this for a long time, but I thought maybe it was time to try again." David moved closer, pretending to examine the selection of pastries on the table while listening to their conversation. He was fascinated by this woman's story, though not in a good way. A community center teacher who hadn't competed in years. This confirmed everything he had suspected about her. "What piece are you performing?" the other woman asked. "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, came the quiet reply. David nearly choked on the cookie he had just taken a bite of. Rachmaninoff's Third. Was she serious? That piece was considered one of the most technically demanding works in the entire piano repertoire. Professional pianists spent years preparing for it, and many never attempted it at all. The nickname Rach 3 sent shivers down the spines of even experienced performers. He turned to look at her more directly, thinking he must have misheard. but the woman was nodding as her conversation partner's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh my," the other competitor said. "That's quite an ambitious choice. I've always been too intimidated to even think about attempting that piece." The community center teacher smiled modestly. "It's challenging, but I've been working on it for a while. My mother actually suggested it. She said if I was going to compete again, I should choose something that really meant something to me." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was either incredible naivety or shocking arrogance. Rachmaninoff's Third wasn't just difficult. It was a piece that separated serious pianists from pretenders. The technical demands alone required years of advanced training, and the musical interpretation needed deep understanding that came only from extensive performance experience. He found himself walking over to their conversation, unable to resist getting involved. "Excuse me," he said, interrupting politely. "I couldn't help but overhear. Did you say you're performing Rachmaninoff's Third today?" The woman turned to him, and David noticed her eyes were kind but tired, as if she hadn't been sleeping well. "Yes, that's right. Are you familiar with the piece?" David almost laughed out loud. Was he familiar with it? He had been studying Rachmaninoff's works for over a decade. "I know it quite well, actually. It's considered one of the most challenging pieces in classical piano literature. May I ask what your background is?" The woman seemed a bit surprised by his directness but answered politely. "I teach piano at the Jefferson Community Center. I work with students of all ages, from children just starting out to adults who always wanted to learn." "I see," David said, his tone becoming slightly condescending without him even realizing it. "And how long have you been preparing this particular piece?" "About 6 months," she replied, sensing something in his voice but maintaining her polite demeanor. David nodded, putting on what he thought was a helpful expression. 6 months is quite optimistic for a piece of this complexity. Have you had professional training in advanced repertoire?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The other competitor sensed the tension and quietly excused herself, leaving David and the community center teacher alone by the refreshment table. "I have some background in classical training," the woman said carefully, "but I've been focused on teaching for the past several years." David decided to be more direct. "Look, I don't want to discourage you, but Rachmaninoff's Third isn't really appropriate for community-level players. It requires years of professional study and performance experience. Perhaps you might consider something more suitable for your skill level. There are many beautiful intermediate pieces that would be much more appropriate for someone with your background." The woman's cheeks flushed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident in my preparation." David shook his head, genuinely believing he was being helpful. "I've been performing professionally for over 20 years. I've seen many talented amateur players attempt pieces beyond their capabilities, and it rarely ends well. The judges here are professionals who will immediately recognize when someone is out of their depth." He paused, then continued with what he thought was kindness. "There's no shame in knowing your limitations. In fact, it shows wisdom. A well-executed intermediate piece will always be more impressive than a struggling attempt at advanced repertoire." The woman set down her coffee cup and looked directly at him for the first time. "What piece are you performing today?" "Chopin's Ballade No. 1, David replied, straightening slightly with pride. "That's a beautiful piece," she said genuinely. "Chopin requires such delicate touch and emotional understanding." David was surprised by her response. He had expected her to be impressed by his choice, but instead she spoke about it with the kind of casual familiarity that suggested real knowledge of the repertoire. "Yes, well, it's a piece I've been perfecting for quite some time," he said, slightly deflated by her understated reaction. The woman smiled politely. "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully. Good luck today." As she turned to walk away, David felt compelled to add one more piece of advice. "Really, you should consider withdrawing and saving yourself the embarrassment. These competitions can be quite humbling for people who aren't used to this level of scrutiny." The woman paused and turned back to him. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes that David couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger or hurt, but something deeper and more complex. "Thank you for your concern," she said quietly, "but I think I'll see how it goes." As she walked away, David felt satisfied that he had done his good deed for the day. He had tried to save her from public embarrassment, and that was all he could do. Some people had to learn their lessons the hard way. What David didn't realize was that his condescending advice had just awakened something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The quiet community center teacher was about to remind him why assumptions can be dangerous things. The conversation at the refreshment table hadn't gone unnoticed. Several other competitors had been nearby, and word began to spread quietly through the reception area. David Rodriguez, the famous pianist, was questioning whether someone should even be allowed to compete. The story grew slightly with each telling, as stories do, until it became clear that some kind of confrontation had occurred. David, meanwhile, continued his networking around the room, completely unaware of the whispers following him. He was feeling rather pleased with himself for trying to help that misguided woman. In his mind, he had shown both expertise and kindness by steering her away from what would surely be an embarrassing performance. About 20 minutes later, as David was discussing technique with another competitor, he noticed a small group had gathered near where the community center teacher stood. She was still holding her coffee, still speaking in that same quiet voice, but now she had an audience of 4 or 5 other musicians. Curiosity got the better of him, and David drifted closer to see what was so interesting about their conversation. The thing about Rachmaninoff, the woman was saying, is that people focus so much on the technical fireworks that they sometimes miss the emotional story he's telling. The third concerto isn't just about how fast you can play the difficult passages, it's about longing and memory and the weight of things you can't change. One of the listeners, a young woman with short red hair, nodded eagerly. I've always felt that way about his music, but could never put it into words. Do you really think the technical stuff is secondary? Not secondary, the teacher replied thoughtfully. But technique should serve the music, not the other way around. When you're playing Rachmaninoff, you have to understand that he was writing from a place of deep sadness. He was homesick for a Russia that no longer existed. That grief has to come through in every note, or you're just playing gymnastics. David frowned. This woman was speaking about Rachmaninoff with the kind of insight that usually came from years of serious study and performance. Her analysis was sophisticated, nuanced, and frankly, more perceptive than what he heard from many professional musicians. One of the men in the group asked, "Have you recorded any of his pieces?" The woman shook her head with a small smile. "No, nothing like that. I've spent a lot of time with his music over the years." David couldn't contain himself any longer. He stepped into the circle, his voice carrying just a bit more authority than necessary. "That's all very poetic," he said, "but Rachmaninoff's third is ultimately about technical mastery. The emotional content only matters if you can actually execute the piece properly. Otherwise, it's just wishful thinking." The group turned to look at him, and David immediately felt their energy shift. He had interrupted something, and they weren't happy about it. The community center teacher looked at him calmly. "I suppose we have different approaches to music." "I have 20 years of professional experience," David replied, his voice becoming slightly defensive. "I've performed this concerto with major orchestras. Trust me, the technical demands are what separate the professionals from the amateurs." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The young woman with red hair looked back and forth between them, clearly sensing tension but not understanding its source. The teacher took a sip of her coffee and said quietly, "I'm sure your performances have been lovely." There was something in the way she said lovely that irritated David immensely. It wasn't insulting exactly, but it felt dismissive, as if she were patting him on the head and telling him he had done a good job. "Look," David said, his patience finally wearing thin. "I tried to be nice about this earlier, but I think you're setting yourself up for embarrassment. Rachmaninoff's third isn't a community centerpiece. It requires years of advanced training and professional-level technique. I'm not trying to be mean, I'm trying to be realistic." The woman set down her coffee cup on a nearby table. When she looked back at David, something had changed in her expression. The timidity was gone, replaced by something steadier and more confident. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. David felt emboldened by what he interpreted as a challenge. The small group around them had grown, and he was aware that other competitors were now watching their exchange with interest. "I'm suggesting," David said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "that you're out of your league. This is an amateur hour. The judges here are serious musicians who can tell the difference between real talent and wishful thinking." The woman nodded slowly. "So you don't think I can play Rachmaninoff's third?" "Frankly, no, I don't," David replied. "And I think you're going to embarrass yourself and waste everyone's time trying." More people had gathered now, drawn by the obvious tension in David's voice. The room had grown quieter, with conversations stopping as people turned to watch what was happening. The community center teacher looked around at the growing audience, then back at David. "What would it take to convince you that you're wrong?" David laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "You'd have to actually play the piece competently, which I don't believe is possible given your background. And if I did?" The question hung in the air. David realized he had painted himself into a corner in front of a room full of people. His reputation was based on being right about music, about talent, about who belonged in serious competitions and who didn't. "If you could actually play Rachmaninoff's Third at a professional level," he heard himself saying, "I would personally apologize to you in front of everyone here and donate $1,000 to your community center." The room went completely silent. Someone in the back whispered, "Did he just bet $1,000? The woman looked at David for a long moment, and he saw something in her eyes that made him slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't anger or hurt anymore. It was something that looked almost like pity. "That's very generous," she said quietly, "but I wouldn't want to take your money." "You won't be taking it," David replied confidently, "because you can't deliver on what you're claiming." "All right," she said simply. "We'll see." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about what they had just witnessed, David felt a mixture of satisfaction and slight unease. He had defended the integrity of serious music competition, but something about the woman's calm confidence bothered him. He pushed the feeling aside. In a few hours, when her performance inevitably fell apart under the pressure of professional scrutiny, everyone would see that he had been right all along. Sometimes being right wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. What David didn't know was that he had just challenged someone who had once been considered one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. Someone who had given up everything for family, but had never stopped loving music with the kind of passion that doesn't fade, no matter how long it stays hidden. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both of their lives forever. The competition began promptly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The performance hall at Steinway was elegant and intimate, with about 200 seats arranged in a gentle curve facing the magnificent black grand piano on stage. The judges sat at a long table near the front, their scorecards and programs neatly arranged before them. David had drawn number 7 in the performance order, which meant he would perform in the middle of the afternoon session. The community center teacher had drawn number 12, placing her near the end of the day. As David took his seat in the audience to watch the other competitors, he felt confident about his position. Going 7th would allow him to set a high standard that the remaining performers would struggle to match. The first few performances were exactly what David had expected. Competent but unremarkable, playing from musicians who clearly had talent, but lacked the polish and depth that came from serious professional training. One young man attempted a Chopin etude that was slightly beyond his technical abilities, resulting in several missed notes and uneven tempo. A middle-aged woman played a beautiful Mozart sonata, but her interpretation was safe and predictable, lacking any personal insight or emotional risk. David found himself mentally critiquing each performance, noting technical flaws and interpretive choices that revealed the amateur status of most competitors. This was exactly why regional competitions frustrated him. They mixed serious musicians with weekend players, creating events that lacked the consistent high standards of professional venues. When his turn came, David walked to the stage with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He adjusted the piano bench with practiced efficiency, flexed his fingers briefly, and began Chopin's Ballade No. 1 without any visible nervousness. From the very first notes, it was clear that David was operating on a different level from the previous performers. His technique was flawless, his fingerwork precise and even. The difficult passages that had challenged earlier performers seemed effortless under his hands. He shaped phrases with professional skill, building dramatic tension and releasing it with perfect timing. The audience responded immediately to the elevated quality of his playing. People sat up straighter, stopped shifting in their seats, and gave him their complete attention. The judges exchanged glances and made notes on their scorecards. David could feel their appreciation, and it fueled his performance. As he moved through the piece, David allowed himself to add subtle flourishes that showcased his technical superiority. He took slight tempo liberties that only a confident performer would attempt, and he brought out inner voices in the harmony that less skilled pianists often missed entirely. This was David at his best, playing with the kind of authority that came from years of professional experience. When he finished, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. David stood, bowed gracefully, and walked off stage feeling completely satisfied. Several audience members continued clapping longer than usual, and he could see approval on the judges' faces. That performance had set the bar exactly where he wanted it. As David returned to his seat, other competitors approached to congratulate him. "That was incredible," whispered the young woman with red hair who had been part of the earlier conversation. "I don't think any of us can compete with that level of playing." David accepted the compliments graciously while maintaining appropriate humility. "Thank you. Chopin is such a wonderful composer. The music really plays itself once you understand what he was trying to express." The next few performers seemed somewhat deflated by David's impressive showing. It was clear that they were now playing in the shadow of what everyone recognized as the performance to beat. A few managed respectable interpretations of their chosen pieces, but none approached the professional standard that David had demonstrated. As the afternoon progressed, David found his attention wandering slightly. He had essentially won the competition already, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the official results. He thought about the prize money and the qualification for nationals that would come with first place. More importantly, he thought about how his reputation would be enhanced by yet another victory. Then, number 11 was announced, and David refocused on the stage. Only one more performer after this, and then they could get to the award ceremony where his victory would be made official. Competitor number 11 was a nervous young man who had chosen a Bach invention. His performance was technically adequate but emotionally flat, exactly the kind of safe, uninspired playing that David had come to expect from amateur competitions. The audience applauded politely but without real enthusiasm. As the applause died down, the competition coordinator took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final performer this afternoon is contestant number 12. David looked around the audience and spotted the community center teacher sitting in the back row. She was wearing the same simple blue dress and she looked calm but focused. As her name was called, she stood and began walking toward the stage. David watched her approach the piano with mild curiosity. He was actually looking forward to this performance, not because he expected it to be good, but because it would vindicate everything he had said earlier. The gap between her amateur status and the demands of Rachmaninoff's third would be obvious to everyone in the room. His public challenge would be proven correct, and perhaps other amateur players would think twice before entering competitions beyond their skill level. The woman took her time adjusting the bench and positioning herself at the piano. David noticed that her movements were economical and precise, without any wasted motion or nervous energy. She sat quietly for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, eyes closed as if she were centering herself. When she opened her eyes and placed her hands on the keys, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. David couldn't quite identify what had changed, but suddenly the casual murmur of the audience died away completely. Even the judges seemed to lean forward slightly as if sensing that something different was about to happen. The woman's posture had transformed. Gone was the tentative, apologetic demeanor she had shown earlier. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed but confident. Her hands hovered over the keys with the kind of natural authority that David recognized from his own performances and those of other professionals. For the first time since issuing his challenge, David felt a tiny flutter of uncertainty in his stomach. There was something about the way she held herself at the piano that didn't match his assumptions about her background and abilities. Then she began to play, and David's world changed forever. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hall, and within seconds David realized he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't the stumbling attempt of an amateur trying to play beyond her abilities. This was the sound of someone who understood this music at the deepest possible level. As the familiar melody unfolded under her fingers, David felt his confidence crumbling like a house built on sand. Everything he thought he knew about this woman, everything he had assumed about her abilities was being systematically destroyed by the most beautiful playing he had heard in years. The first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 began with a melody so simple and beautiful that it seemed impossible anything so pure could contain the technical storms that lay ahead. But in the hands of the woman at the piano, those opening notes carried something that made David's chest tighten with recognition and dread. This wasn't just competent playing. This was the sound of someone who had lived with this music for so long that it had become part of her DNA. Every phrase breathed with natural expression, each note placed with the kind of certainty that came only from profound understanding. David gripped the armrests of his seat as the music continued. The woman's technique was not just adequate, it was stunning. Her fingers moved across the keys with liquid fluidity, making the most difficult passages appear effortless. But what was even more impressive was her musical interpretation. She wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was telling a story that reached into the hearts of everyone listening. The audience sat in absolute silence, transfixed. David could see people leaning forward, some with their mouths slightly open in amazement. The judges had stopped taking notes and were simply listening, their professional composure replaced by genuine wonder. As the first movement developed, the technical demands increased exponentially. Rachmaninoff had written passages that stretched human capabilities to their limits, combining lightning-fast scales with massive chords that required enormous handspans and physical strength. Most pianists approached these sections with visible strain, fighting to maintain control as the music threatened to spiral beyond their abilities. But the community center teacher played through these challenges as if they were gentle warm-up exercises. Her hands moved with graceful precision, never appearing rushed or strained despite the incredible speed and complexity of the music. When massive chords required her to stretch across vast distances on the keyboard, her fingers found their targets with unerring accuracy. David felt sweat beading on his forehead as he watched her navigate a particularly treacherous passage that he himself had struggled with for months when learning the piece years ago. She played it not only cleanly, but with such musical conviction that it sounded like the most natural thing in the world. But technique was only part of what was happening on stage. The emotional depth of her interpretation was what truly separated this performance from anything David had heard in years. When Rachmaninoff's melody returned in different forms throughout the movement, she shaped each iteration with subtle variations that revealed new layers of meaning. Her understanding of the composer's harmonic language was so complete that she could bring out inner voices and subtle details that most listeners never even knew existed. David found himself thinking about his own performance earlier that day. He had been proud of his Chopin, and rightfully so. It had been technically excellent and musically intelligent. But sitting here listening to this woman play Rachmaninoff, he realized the difference between good professional playing and true artistry. His performance had been impressive. Hers was transcendent. The first movement built toward its climactic conclusion, where soloist and imaginary orchestra engaged in musical combat of breathtaking intensity. This was where most amateur attempts at the piece fell apart completely, as the technical and physical demands pushed players beyond their limits. David held his breath, certain that this was where reality would finally intrude on what seemed like an impossible dream. Instead, the woman's playing seemed to gain power and authority as the music became more demanding. She attacked the massive chords with fearless commitment, her whole body engaged in producing the volume and intensity the music required. The piano responded to her touch like a living thing, singing and thundering under her hands with a range of colors that David had only heard from the very best concert artists. When the first movement finally concluded, the silence that followed was profound. For several seconds, nobody moved or made a sound. The woman sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, breathing deeply from the physical exertion of the performance. Then someone in the back of the hall began to applaud, and the spell was broken. The audience erupted in appreciation that went far beyond the polite recognition given to earlier performers. People were on their feet applauding with genuine enthusiasm for what they had just witnessed. Several audience members wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the emotional power of the performance. David remained in his seat, unable to move or process what he had just experienced. Everything he thought he knew about music, about talent, about who belonged in serious competitions, had been shattered in the space of 15 minutes. The woman he had dismissed as an amateur had just delivered one of the finest performances of one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. As the applause continued, David's mind raced through the implications of what he had witnessed. His public challenge, made so confidently just hours earlier, now seemed like the height of arrogance and stupidity. He had bet against someone who was clearly operating on a level far beyond his own abilities. But even worse than the embarrassment was the growing realization of what this woman's presence at a regional competition meant. Professional pianists of her caliber didn't compete in regional events unless something extraordinary was happening. Either she was slumming for easy prize money, which seemed unlikely given her modest appearance and gentle demeanor, or there was a story here that David didn't understand. The woman finally stood and bowed to the audience, accepting their appreciation with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the day. Her smile was genuine but subdued, as if she were grateful for their response but not surprised by the quality of her own playing. As she walked off stage, David caught sight of her face and was struck by something he hadn't noticed before. Despite her modest appearance and quiet manner, there was something in her eyes that spoke of experience far beyond what he had assumed. This was not the face of someone playing beyond her abilities. This was the face of someone who had temporarily returned to a world she knew intimately. The competition coordinator took the microphone to announce that there would be a brief intermission before the awards ceremony. David used this opportunity to slip out of the main hall, needing air and space to process what had just happened. In the lobby, he overheard fragments of excited conversations from audience members and other competitors. Words like incredible, professional level, and where did she come from drifted past him as people tried to understand what they had witnessed. David pulled out his phone and, with shaking fingers, began searching for information about the woman who had just destroyed his assumptions and possibly his reputation. He had to understand who she really was and how he had gotten everything so completely wrong. What he was about to discover would make his embarrassment even deeper and his lesson even more profound. David stood in the lobby, his phone trembling in his hands as he tried to search for information about the woman who had just shattered his understanding of everything he thought he knew about music and talent. The problem was he didn't even know her full name. All he had heard during registration was Linda Chen, but thousands of people shared variations of that name. He tried searching Linda Chen Pianist, but the results were overwhelming and mostly irrelevant. Concert pianists, piano teachers, students, amateur players all mixed together in a sea of information that told him nothing useful. His hands were shaking too much to type effectively, and his mind was still reeling from what he had witnessed on stage. David looked around the lobby and spotted the registration volunteer who had checked him in that morning. She was an older woman who seemed to know everyone and everything about the competition. If anyone would have information about the competitors, it would be her. "Excuse me," David said, approaching her table. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." The woman who just performed, contestant number 12. "Could you tell me anything about her background?" The volunteer, whose name tag read Betty, looked up at him with kind eyes. "Oh, you mean Linda? Wasn't that performance just extraordinary? I've been volunteering at these competitions for 15 years and I've never heard anything quite like that." "Yes, it was remarkable," David managed to say. "I was just curious about her background." "Has she competed here before?" Betty shook her head. "No, this is her first time entering our regional competition, but let me check her registration form." She shuffled through a stack of papers and pulled out a document. "Here we are. Linda Chen, age 32, currently employed as a piano instructor at Jefferson Community Center." David's heart sank a little deeper. So she really was a community center teacher, just as she had said. But that performance, does it say anything about her previous experience or training? Betty scanned the form more carefully. Well, it asks for educational background, and she wrote down Juilliard School Bachelor of Music, piano performance. But that doesn't tell us much about when she graduated or what she's done since then. Juilliard. The word hit David like a physical blow. The Juilliard School was arguably the most prestigious conservatory in the world. Only the most exceptionally talented musicians even gained admission, and those who graduated were virtually guaranteed successful professional careers. If Linda had graduated from Juilliard, why was she teaching at a community center? "Is there anything else on the form?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Betty continued reading. She listed her emergency contact as Helen Chen, mother, with a local address. And under additional information, she wrote something interesting. Betty squinted at the handwriting. It says returning to competition after 10-year hiatus due to family obligations. 10 years. David's mind raced with the implications. If Linda had graduated from Juilliard and then stopped performing professionally for a decade, there had to be a story there. And if she was just now returning to competition after such a long break, that performance became even more remarkable. David thanked Betty and walked back toward the performance hall, pulling out his phone again. This time he searched more specifically. Linda Chen Juilliard pianist. The results were still numerous, but he began scrolling through them more carefully, looking for any mention that might match the woman he had just heard play. On the third page of results, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was an old article from a classical music magazine, dated 12 years earlier. The headline read, "Rising star Linda Chen wins International Young Artists Competition." David clicked on the article with trembling fingers. The photograph showed a young woman who was unmistakably the same person he had encountered that day, but 12 years younger and dressed in an elegant evening gown, standing next to a concert grand piano with a bouquet of flowers and a crystal trophy. The article described Linda as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation and detailed her victory in a prestigious international competition that had launched the careers of many famous artists. It mentioned her upcoming debut with the New York Philharmonic and a recording contract with a major classical label. David's stomach churned as he continued reading. The article quoted Linda saying, "I feel so blessed to be able to share my love of music with the world. I hope to inspire young people to discover the joy and beauty that classical music can bring to their lives." But that wasn't the worst part. As David scrolled further, he found another article from a year later. This one was much shorter and appeared in the local news section rather than the arts pages. The headline read, "Local Pianist Cancels Tour, Dates Due to Family Emergency." The brief article explained that Linda Chen, who had been scheduled to perform with several major orchestras over the coming season, had canceled all her professional engagements following the sudden death of her father in a car accident. She was quoted as saying, "My family needs me right now, and that has to be my priority. Music will always be there, but this is a time when my mother and younger brother need my support." David found one more article, dated about 6 months after that. It was barely a paragraph, tucked away in a classical music newsletter. "Pianist Linda Chen has withdrawn from her recording contract and will be taking an indefinite break from professional performance to care for family responsibilities." And then, nothing. No more articles, no more mentions in classical music publications, no more concert reviews. It was as if one of the most promising young pianists in the world had simply vanished from the professional music scene. David leaned against the wall, feeling physically sick. The woman he had condescended to, the amateur he had publicly challenged and humiliated, was someone who had been internationally recognized as a rising star before she was 25. She had given up what would likely have been a brilliant international career to take care of her family after a tragedy. And for the past 10 years, while David had been building his regional reputation and winning competitions against genuinely amateur players, Linda had been teaching children at a community center and caring for her mother. She had set aside her extraordinary gifts to honor responsibilities that most people would never have to face. The full weight of his arrogance crashed down on him. He had assumed that someone dressed modestly and working at a community center couldn't possibly have serious musical abilities. He had judged her based on her current circumstances rather than understanding that life sometimes forced people to make impossible choices between their dreams and their duties. Worse still, he had made his assumptions and judgments publicly, in front of other competitors and music lovers who were now witnessing the spectacular wrongness of his assessment. The $1,000 bet he had made so confidently now seemed like the least of his problems. David realized he was facing something much more serious than simple embarrassment. He had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of musician he claimed to despise, someone who valued status and appearances over actual talent and dedication. He had become a musical snob of the worst kind, blind to excellence when it didn't come wrapped in the package he expected. As he walked back into the performance hall, where the awards ceremony was about to begin, David knew that his life as a musician was about to change forever. The question was whether he would learn from this devastating lesson or let his pride destroy any chance of becoming the kind of artist that Linda Chen clearly was. Woman who had sacrificed everything for love, and duty was about to teach him what real music and real character actually looked like. The award ceremony began 30 minutes later in the same performance hall where David's world had been turned upside down. He sat in the third row, his mind still reeling from the research he had conducted during intermission. Around him, audience members and competitors filled the space with excited chatter about Linda's extraordinary performance. David caught fragments of conversations that made his stomach churn with shame. "I had no idea we had someone of that caliber competing today," whispered an elderly woman behind him. "That was the most beautiful Rachmaninoff I've heard since I saw Vladimir Ashkenazy perform it in Carnegie Hall." Another voice added, "Did you hear that man earlier challenging her? He must be feeling pretty foolish right about now." The competition coordinator took the stage and began the formal announcement of results. David barely listened as the third and second place winners were announced. He knew what was coming, and the knowledge filled him with a mixture of dread and something else he couldn't quite identify. Was it relief? Anticipation? The approaching moment of reckoning that would force him to confront the full magnitude of his mistake? "Ladies and gentlemen," the coordinator announced, "this year's first place winner, by unanimous decision of all 5 judges, is contestant number 12, Linda Chen." The applause that erupted was unlike anything David had ever heard at a regional competition. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping that usually greeted winners. This was genuine, enthusiastic appreciation from an audience that recognized they had witnessed something extraordinary. People stood immediately, their applause sustained and heartfelt. David remained seated, unable to move as he watched Linda walk gracefully to the stage. She wore the same simple blue dress, the same modest demeanor, but now David saw her completely differently. This wasn't a community center teacher who had gotten lucky. This was a world-class artist who had temporarily returned to claim what had always been rightfully hers. As Linda accepted her award, she was handed a microphone to address the audience. David's heart pounded as he waited to hear what she would say. Would she mention his challenge? Would she publicly embarrass him the way he had tried to embarrass her? "Thank you so much," Linda began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to share music with all of you today. It's been far too long since I've participated in a competition, and I had forgotten how wonderful it feels to be part of a community of musicians who are all pursuing their passion for this beautiful art form." She paused, looking out at the audience with genuine warmth. "I want to acknowledge all the other performers today. Each person who had the courage to come here and share their music with us deserves our respect and appreciation. Making music at any level requires vulnerability and dedication. I was moved by every single performance I heard." David felt tears stinging his eyes. Even now in her moment of triumph, Linda was showing grace and humility. She was using her victory not to celebrate her own superiority, but to lift up everyone who had participated. "I also want to thank my mother," Linda continued, "who encouraged me to enter this competition when I wasn't sure I was ready to perform again. Sometimes the people who love us see possibilities that we can't see ourselves." As Linda concluded her remarks and the formal ceremony ended, David knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. He had made a public challenge, and she had met it spectacularly. Now he had to face the consequences of his arrogance with whatever dignity he could muster. David stood and began walking toward the stage, where Linda was accepting congratulations from other competitors and audience members. His legs felt unsteady and his mouth was dry. He had given thousands of performances over the years, but he had never been more nervous than he was at this moment. The crowd around Linda parted slightly as David approached. Several people looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Word of his earlier challenge had spread, and people were clearly interested to see how he would handle this moment. Linda saw him coming and turned to face him directly. Her expression was calm and patient, without any trace of smugness or vindictiveness. If anything, she looked slightly concerned, as if she were worried about how he was feeling. "Linda," David began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I owe you an apology." The conversations around them died away as people strained to hear what he would say. David was acutely aware that his next words would define him as a person and as a musician for everyone present. "I was completely wrong about you," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I made assumptions based on appearances and circumstances, and I spoke to you with disrespect that was both cruel and ignorant. You have just given one of the finest performances I have ever heard, and I am deeply ashamed of how I treated you." Linda listened without interrupting, her expression compassionate rather than victorious. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook. His hands shook as he wrote out a check for $1,000 to the Jefferson Community Center. "I made a commitment," he said, "and I intend to honor it. But this isn't payment for losing a bet. This is a small gesture of respect for someone whose talent and character I completely failed to recognize." He handed her the check, then looked out at the audience that had gathered around them. "I want everyone here to know that Linda Chen is not just a community center teacher who got lucky today. She is one of the most accomplished pianists I have ever encountered, and I hope this won't be the last time we have the privilege of hearing her perform." David turned back to Linda, who was looking at the check with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "not just for the bet, but for trying to discourage you from sharing your incredible gift with the world." Linda folded the check carefully and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more to me than you might realize." Then, to David's surprise, she continued, "I want you to know that your performance today was genuinely beautiful. You have real talent and obvious dedication to your craft. I hope this experience doesn't discourage you from continuing to pursue music with passion and joy." David felt something break open inside his chest. Here was a woman he had tried to humiliate, responding to his apology with generosity and encouragement. She was showing him a kind of grace that he wasn't sure he deserved but desperately needed. "Thank you," was all he could manage to say. As the crowd began to disperse, several audience members approached Linda to share their appreciation for her performance. But David noticed something else happening. Other audience members were pulling out their phones, clearly inspired by Linda's story and wanting to contribute to her community center program. An elderly gentleman stepped forward. "Young lady, that was the most moving performance I've heard in decades. I'd like to make a donation to your music program as well." He handed Linda a check for $500. A middle-aged couple approached next. "We've been looking for a way to support music education in our community," the woman said. "After hearing you play today, we know we want to help." Their donation was for $750. One by one, people came forward with donations of various amounts. By the time the crowd had thinned, Linda was holding contributions totaling over $4,000 for the Jefferson Community Center music program. David watched this outpouring of generosity with a mixture of amazement and deep gratitude. His challenge, born of arrogance and ignorance, had inadvertently created an opportunity for Linda's work with disadvantaged children to receive support it desperately needed. As he prepared to leave, David realized that this day had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had learned lessons about humility, about the danger of assumptions, and about the true meaning of musical excellence that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But most importantly, he had encountered someone whose character and talent had shown him what it really meant to be an artist. The question now was what he would do with that knowledge. 6 months had passed since the competition that changed David's life forever. As he walked through the doors of the Jefferson Community Center on a crisp Saturday morning, he reflected on how dramatically his world had shifted since that humbling day at Steinway Hall. The community center was a modest building in a working-class neighborhood, far removed from the prestigious concert halls and conservatories where David had built his reputation. The walls were painted in cheerful but slightly faded colors, and the floors showed the wear of thousands of children and families who had passed through over the years. David carried his music bag and a box of new sheet music he had purchased for the students. This had become his routine every Saturday morning for the past 4 months. After that devastating day at the competition, he had reached out to Linda to ask if he could volunteer at the center. He hadn't expected her to say yes, but she had welcomed him with the same grace she had shown throughout their entire encounter. As David entered the main music room, he could hear the sounds of Linda working with a young student. Through the doorway, he saw her sitting beside a 7-year-old girl at an old upright piano, patiently guiding small fingers to the correct keys. Her voice was gentle and encouraging, exactly the opposite of how David had once approached teaching. "Remember, music is about telling a story," Linda was saying to her student. "Even when you're just playing scales, try to imagine you're painting with sound. What colors do you hear in these notes?" The little girl, whose name was Rosa, giggled, and pressed the keys with renewed enthusiasm. "This one sounds like sunshine," she announced, hitting a bright major chord. "That's beautiful," Linda replied. "You have wonderful musical instincts, Rosa. Let's see what other colors we can find." David smiled as he watched this interaction. In the months he had been volunteering here, he had witnessed Linda's teaching approach countless times, and it never failed to amaze him. She had the ability to make every student feel special and capable, regardless of their skill level or background. When Rosa's lesson ended, Linda walked her to the lobby where her grandmother was waiting. David took this opportunity to set up his own teaching space in the adjacent room, where he worked with intermediate students who were ready for more challenging repertoire. "Good morning, David," Linda said as she returned. "How are you feeling about today's masterclass?" Today was special. Over the past months, as word had spread about the extraordinary pianist teaching at the Jefferson Community Center, more advanced students had begun enrolling in the program. David and Linda had decided to hold monthly masterclasses where the most promising students could perform for each other and receive detailed feedback. "I'm excited," David replied honestly. "These kids have been working so hard, and some of them are really ready to perform more challenging pieces." Linda nodded, then looked at him with the kind of direct attention that had become familiar over their months of working together. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've been doing here. The students have benefited so much from having access to your professional experience and knowledge." David shook his head. "I should be thanking you. This has been the most rewarding musical experience of my life." And he meant it. Teaching at the community center had opened David's eyes to aspects of music he had never considered during his professional career. These students didn't have access to expensive instruments or prestigious teachers. Many came from families where paying for music lessons was a real sacrifice. But their enthusiasm and dedication often surpassed that of the privileged students David had encountered in conservatory settings. One of David's regular students, a 12-year-old boy named Miguel, had been working on a Mozart sonata despite having only an old keyboard at home for practice. His family couldn't afford a real piano, but Miguel's determination was extraordinary. He would stay after his lessons to practice on the center's instruments, sometimes for hours. Another student, 16-year-old Ashley, had discovered through Linda's program that she had genuine talent for classical music. She was now preparing for auditions to music schools, something that would have been impossible without the scholarship program that had grown from the donations received after Linda's competition victory. As students began arriving for the master class, David marveled at the diversity of the group. There were children from different cultural backgrounds, various economic circumstances, and wide-ranging skill levels. But they all shared the same spark that David had first fallen in love with as a child: the pure joy of making music. The master class began with Miguel performing the Mozart sonata he had been preparing. As David listened to the boy's careful, earnest interpretation, he remembered his own attitude just months earlier. He would have focused on technical imperfections, the places where Miguel's limited practice time showed, the rough edges that revealed his amateur status. Now, David heard something entirely different. He heard a young musician pouring his heart into beautiful music, overcoming obstacles through sheer determination and love for his art. When Miguel finished, David's feedback focused on the musical choices that had worked well and offered gentle suggestions for improvement. "Miguel, your phrasing in the slow movement was really beautiful," David said. "You understood the emotional character of that music perfectly. For the faster sections, let's work on some practice techniques that will help you build the finger strength you need." Linda caught David's eye and smiled. In the early weeks of his volunteering, she had gently guided him toward this more constructive approach to teaching. She had shown him how to build students up rather than tear them down, how to nurture confidence while still maintaining high standards. Ashley performed next, playing a challenging Chopin nocturne with remarkable sensitivity for someone her age. As David listened, he was struck by the realization that Ashley might have more natural musical instinct than many of the conservatory students he had encountered over the years. After the masterclass ended and the students had left, David and Linda sat in the quiet music room, surrounded by the donated instruments and music stands that had transformed this space into a thriving musical community. "I've been thinking about something," David said. "Before I met you, I thought I understood what it meant to be a successful musician. I measured everything by competitions won, prestigious venues performed in, recognition from professional colleagues. Linda listened without interrupting, a quality David had come to deeply appreciate about her. But watching you work with these students, seeing how music can change their lives and give them confidence and joy, David continued, I realize I had it completely backward. Real success isn't about impressing other musicians or building your own reputation. It's about serving something larger than yourself. Linda was quiet for a moment before responding. I think there's room for both kinds of musical life. The world needs concert artists who can share great music with large audiences, but it also needs teachers and community programs that make music accessible to people who might otherwise never have the chance to discover their own musical gifts. What made you choose this path? David asked. After your father died, you could have returned to professional performing once your family was stable. Why did you stay? Linda looked around the room, at the donated pianos and the bulletin board covered with photos of student performances and achievement certificates. At first, it was necessity. My mother needed support, and my younger brother was still in school. But as I started teaching, I discovered something I hadn't expected. Working with these students, seeing their excitement when they master a difficult passage or express something beautiful through music, gives me a kind of fulfillment that performing never did. She paused, then added, Don't get me wrong. I loved performing, and I still do when opportunities arise. But there's something special about planting seeds, about helping someone else discover their own musical voice. David nodded, understanding completely. Over the past months, he had experienced that same fulfillment. Watching Miguel's confidence grow, seeing Ashley prepare for auditions that could change her life, helping other students discover the joy of classical music. These experiences had given his own musical life new meaning and purpose. I've been offered a position at the state university, David said, teaching piano in their music department. I wanted to ask if you thought I should take it. Linda looked at him with interest. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity. What's making you hesitate? I don't want to stop working here, David admitted. This program, these students, this community you've built, it's become the most important part of my musical life. Linda smiled. Who says you have to choose? University teaching would give you financial stability and the chance to work with advanced students. But there's no reason you couldn't continue volunteering here as well. In fact, having connections at the university might help us create scholarship opportunities for our most talented students. As they talked, David realized that Linda was once again showing him possibilities he hadn't seen himself. She had a gift for helping people expand their vision of what was possible, both musically and personally. 6 months ago, David had been a successful but arrogant musician who measured his worth by his ability to outperform others.